The atmosphere begins to ripple, as the curvature of the world suddenly collapses, into a singular, impossible plane. The very fabric of reality screams, as the sphere we call home is flattened, by an unseen, incomprehensible force. Across the horizon, the curve of the ocean vanishes, replaced by an infinite, terrifyingly straight line, that stretches into a void of pure black. Gravity, once a reliable anchor pulling everything toward the center of a globe, begins to twist and warp. It no longer pulls downward toward the soil, instead, it tugs at an agonizing angle, dragging everything on the periphery, toward the new geometric center of the disk. Skyscrapers in London, Tokyo, and New York do not just fall, they are sheared from their foundations, by a gravitational tide that treats steel like wet paper. The air itself begins to scream, as the massive volume of the atmosphere, no longer held in place by a uniform spherical pull, begins to rush toward the center of the disk, in a supersonic gale. This is the cessation of the world as a coherent system. This is the moment physics breaks, and the planet becomes a cosmic anomaly. This is the cessation. But to understand why, we must rewind to the beginning. For 4.5 billion years, the third planet from the Sun has existed as an oblate spheroid. This shape is not a mere cosmic accident, but a fundamental requirement of the laws of thermodynamics and gravity. Gravity, the weakest of the four fundamental forces, but the most relentless over distance, acts equally in all directions. It pulls matter inward, compressing dust and gas into a ball. This spherical shape is the most efficient way to organize matter in a three-dimensional space, minimizing the distance between the surface and the center of mass. Because of this, our world maintains a stable atmosphere, a consistent magnetic field, and a predictable cycle of day and night. The mass of the Earth, roughly 5,972 quintillion metric tons, creates a gravitational field that we experience as a steady 9.8 meters per second squared. This force keeps the air we breathe from leaking into the vacuum of space, and holds the massive volumes of our oceans within their basins. When we consider the transition to a flat plane, we must first address the sheer mechanical impossibility of the structure. To maintain a flat disk of this size, the materials making up the crust would need to possess a tensile strength billions of times greater than steel or diamond. Under normal physics, a flat disk with the mass of the Earth would immediately collapse back into a sphere, a process that would generate enough heat to liquefy the entire planet within seconds. But in this scenario, we assume an unknown force maintains the disk. The first victim of this change is the very concept of down. On a sphere, the center of mass is always directly beneath your feet. On a flat disk, the center of mass is the exact middle of the circle. If you stand at the center, gravity feels normal. But as you walk toward the edge, the center of mass stays behind you. Gravity begins to pull you sideways. The further you travel toward the rim, the more the world feels like a steep, vertical cliff, even though the ground is technically flat. To walk toward the edge of a flat Earth, would be an exercise in extreme mountaineering on level ground. By the time you reach the outer rim, the pull of the center would be so strong, that you would effectively be climbing a wall of 90 degrees. The trees in these regions would not grow straight up, they would grow at a sharp diagonal, straining to reach toward the distant light, while being yanked back toward the North Pole by a relentless gravitational tether. The oceans would follow this same law. Instead of covering the disk evenly, the water would be dragged toward the center, in a global, slow-motion tsunami. The outer continents would be stripped of every drop of moisture, becoming desiccated, airless wastes of bone-dry rock and frozen dust. Meanwhile, the center of the disk would be buried under an ocean thousands of kilometers deep, a crushing weight that would compress the water into exotic states of ice never before seen in nature. The atmosphere would suffer an even more violent fate. Just like the water, the air is a fluid subject to the whims of gravity. On a globe, the atmosphere is a thin, protective blanket held tight against the surface. On a flat disk, the air would rush inward toward the center of mass, accumulating in a massive, towering column of gas over the North Pole. In the central regions, the atmospheric pressure would skyrocket to levels that would crush a human chest like a soda can. The air would become so thick it would behave more like a liquid, turning the sky into a murky, opaque soup of compressed nitrogen and oxygen. Conversely, the edges of the world would be stripped of their atmosphere entirely. The transition would be silent and lethal. As the air moves toward the center, the pressure at the rim drops to zero. The lungs of every living creature in the outer regions would rupture, as the oxygen is sucked out of their bloodstreams. The sky would turn from blue to a bruised purple, and finally to the absolute black of the void, as the last molecules of gas migrate toward the central peak. Without the rotation of a spherical mass, the Earth's core would cease its rhythmic churning. The geodynamo, the process by which the molten iron outer core generates our planetary magnetic field, would stall and fade away. This magnetic shield is the only thing protecting us from the relentless bombardment of the solar wind. As the shield flickers out, the sun begins to strip away the upper layers of the remaining atmosphere. High-energy particles from the sun strike the upper air with the force of microscopic bullets, ionizing the gas and creating a permanent, haunting aurora that spans the entire central sky. But this beauty is a mask for a slow erosion. Without the magnetosphere, the planet is naked to the cosmos, and the very air that remains is slowly bled away into the dark. The sun itself would no longer rise or set in the way we understand. In a flat world, the sun would likely have to be much smaller and much closer, to avoid incinerating the entire disk. It would circle above the plane like a flickering lamp. This creates a nightmare of thermal gradients. In the regions directly beneath the sun's path, the ground would bake under a continuous, unyielding heat. The soil would crack and turn to glass, as temperatures soared well above 100 degrees Celsius. But only a few hundred kilometers away, in the areas where the sun's rays hit at a shallow angle or not at all, the world would be plunged into a permanent, cryogenic winter. There would be no seasons, no weather patterns as we know them, only a static, unchanging landscape of fire and ice. Most turn away from the void. But here at Velastrix, we decode the math behind the chaos. Join the archive by subscribing now. As we descend deeper into the mechanics of this flat reality, the very light we see begins to distort. Because the mass of the disk is so concentrated, the path of light rays would be bent by the intense gravitational well at the center. This is a phenomenon known as gravitational lensing, usually reserved for massive stars and black holes, but on a flat Earth of such impossible density, the effect would be visible to the naked eye. Looking toward the horizon, the world would appear to curve upward, creating the illusion that you are standing at the bottom of a vast, shallow bowl. The stars would not twinkle, they would smear into long, iridescent streaks, as their light is tugged by the disk's mass. The moon, if it still existed, would be pulled into an unstable, wobbling orbit, its reflected light flickering as it struggled against the uneven gravitational pull of the disk. The sound of this world would be a constant, low-frequency thrum. The stress placed upon the crust by the conflicting forces of gravity and the disk's internal structure would cause continuous seismic activity. These would not be the earthquakes we know, which are caused by the movement of tectonic plates. These would be crustal groans, the sound of the very atoms of the Earth being stretched and compressed. The sound would travel through the dense, pressurized air of the center like a physical blow, a resonant frequency that would shatter glass and vibrate through the bones of any surviving observers. It would be a world of perpetual noise, a symphony of breaking stone and rushing wind that never truly falls silent. In the central ocean, where the water has piled up into a mountain of liquid, the pressure at the bottom would reach millions of bars. At these depths, the water molecules would be forced so close together, that they would form hot ice, or ice 7. This is a crystalline structure that remains solid even at temperatures of hundreds of degrees. This central pillar of ice and water would be the only thing left of the planet's hydrosphere, a frozen monument to a broken geometry. The life that once teemed in the oceans would be long gone, crushed into a fine organic silt at the base of this liquid Everest. The outer reaches of the disk would be a cessation of salt and sun-bleached bone, a desert so vast and so dry, that even the memory of rain would be lost to the shifting sands. The biological cessation across the planet would be almost total. Plants, deprived of a stable carbon cycle and a predictable light source, would wither within days. The food chain would collapse from the bottom up. The complex dance of life, which relies on the stability of a spherical world's climate and chemistry, cannot adapt to a world of such extreme gradients. The remaining pockets of life would be limited to the narrow band of the disk where the atmospheric pressure is neither too high nor too low, and the temperature is neither boiling nor freezing. This Goldilocks ring would be a thin, precarious sliver of habitable land, perhaps only a few kilometers wide, circling the central ocean. Here, the last remnants of Earth's ecology would huddle in a twilight world, watching as the stars above continue to smear and the air continues to thin. As the eons passed, the flat Earth would become a ghost. It would be a disk of cold, reset rock drifting through the void, a silent witness to the fact that geometry is destiny. The lack of a magnetic field would eventually allow the solar wind to strip away every last molecule of the atmosphere, leaving the disk as airless and barren as the moon. The central ocean would boil away into space or freeze into a solid, unmoving mass of ice. The colors of the world, the greens of the forests, the blues of the seas, the whites of the clouds, would be replaced by a uniform, dusty gray. The flat Earth would not be a paradise or a secret kept from the masses, it would be a cold, distorted reset, a physical impossibility that could only exist as a brief, violent flicker in the history of the universe. To explore the impossible and visualize the unknown, subscribe to Velastrix.